Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Condo Q's. My name is Ryan Stenquist. I'm the founder of Condo Clear Services, and my lovely co-host.
I'm Sandy Wagner, and I'm currently the president of the Vancouver Island Strata Owners Association, and welcome.
Welcome. So for those of you that are just tuning into Condo Q's, who've never seen any episodes before, basically what it is, it's a half-hour episode segment where we pick a different strata topic. We do it twice a month, the second and fourth Tuesday of every month, with some exceptions, which we'll talk about later on. So we'll talk about any particular topic. Today is depreciation reports. Usually takes us about 10-15 minutes, and then we open it up for comments and questions. So any of you watching live, if you have any questions, by all means leave it in a comment. And if you're watching this recorded after the fact, by all means leave a question as well, and somebody will try and get back to you with an answer to that.
Definitely.
So on to our topic. We're going to be talking about depreciation reports today, which if you've been around stratas at all in the last 4 or 5 years, this has been big news. It was something that the government brought into legislation in 2013. That makes it basically mandatory for most strata corporations in BC to get a depreciation report. 5 units or more are required?
Yes, 5 units or more are required to have a depreciation report. So what is a depreciation report? In 20 words or less, it's a way for the strata to predict their capital costs, like what big projects they're going to need, and do they have enough money in the reserve fund to pay for them. In most other jurisdictions, they're called a reserve fund study, which kind of is a bit more descriptive than a depreciation report. So think of it that way. It's a study of your finances compared to the big projects you're going to need. Yeah,
absolutely. It's I think one of the big reasons why this came into effect, or why the government mandated it, because its depreciation reports aren't anything new. They've been around forever, especially on the commercial side of things. But they're getting a lot more attention now because, of course, they're legislated into being for strata corporations. And a big reason for that was because people were buying into strata corporations, not fully understanding kind of the capital costs side of ownership in a strata corporation, and as a byproduct of that, we're getting hit by a lot of big special levies that were unexpected.
Exactly, and so it's in a way it's consumer protection. That's why the government brought it in for us. So when you're purchasing a strata, you have a general idea of the health of the reserve fund of that strata corporation, to have an idea of whether you might have a special assessment coming up in the near future.
Absolutely, yeah. That's when I'm doing reviews for potential buyers. It's always one of the big questions is, are there any special levies coming up?
Yeah, and your depreciation report isn't going to guarantee, of course. But it'll give you some clues. It'll give you some hints.
Absolutely, and that's actually a really good point to bring up. Is the depreciation reports are not written in stone. They are not the Bible. They are strictly an estimate, both in timeline and in costs.
Exactly.
They're meant to give you a good general idea of what's to be expected, but they're by no means definitive in any way.
Yeah, exactly. So the depreciation report is actually quite a large document, a couple hundred pages, so it's composed of 2 parts. So the first part is a list of all the common assets and the common property, things like the windows, the doors, the roof, the landscaping, anything that the strata may ever have to repair or replace.
Yes.
It lists them all, tells you when it might be expected to be replaced. If your roof is a 30-year roof, but you put it on 20 years ago, you might expect to replace it in about 10 years. So it'll do that for all your items, but it'll also look at your effective age, which is a little different. If you've done excellent maintenance on something, if you say you've got the guy up on the roof doing maintenance every year and doing an inspection every year, maybe you can get 35 years out of your 30-year roof. So it'll have a little look at that as well. So
that's actually a good, before you go off that, that's actually a really good point, is when you're selecting somebody to do a depreciation report, one of the big questions that's handy to ask them is whether or not they use a straight line depreciation method, or whether or not they're looking at the effective estimated age.
Yeah, exactly.
Because depending on who is doing the depreciation report, different appraisers, different engineers will use different methods. So effective estimated age, as you were saying, takes into account the current condition of that component, what kind of maintenance has been done, whereas somebody that's strictly relying on straight line depreciation,
you're just going to look at a table and say, bought it this year, it's going to wear out that year.
Absolutely. So that's a very good point for anybody that's any strata council members. If you're looking at getting a depreciation or getting an update, that's an important question to ask.
Yeah, so ask the provider how they work it out. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so the next thing they do after they list all your potential projects and what year that project might need to be done is they'll give you an estimate of the cost of the project. It's an estimate in today's dollars with just a little teeny bit for inflation factored in, but they don't have a crystal ball. They can't guarantee you that your roof is going to cost $200,000 in 5 years. The price could go up considerably. So it's just an estimate. It's a starting place to get your finances heading towards the right direction.
Yeah.
So after you've got all those, the projects and the estimated costs listed out, the second part is the financial forecasting. And that's where it's kind of interesting. They have to give 3 financial funding models, and usually they'll give you one that's the status quo model. If you don't do anything different than what you're doing now, what are your big projected expenses? Yeah. So they might, go along a little straight line and say, oh, 5 years from now, poof, big special levy coming up. So if you know that a special levy might be coming up in 5 years, you might be encouraged to increase your contributions in advance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. The next financial funding model that most of the providers will give you is what they call a fully funded model. So if you never want to have a special levy ever, how much do you need to put into your depreciation report to avoid special levies? Yeah. And a lot of stratas were surprised to find that they really didn't have enough money set aside. They needed to top up their reserve fund.
You see that a lot in older stratas now, stratas that are getting into that 20 to 30 year area where a lot of components are forecasted to wear out in that time frame. Yeah. And unfortunately, they didn't have the benefit of having these depreciation reports 20 years ago when the CRFs first started getting funded. So you're seeing a lot of buildings that are kind of behind the 8 ball when it comes to their CRF.
And you felt so bad for them. I mean, I was very lucky to be in a strata that where our depreciation report was almost fully funded. We looked on our 30-year horizon, and there was only one special levy in the wind. Good. So but of course, 30 years out is a long way to plan. So you look at the closest 5 years. That's the best place to put your plans. Yeah. And so in between that status quo model and the fully funding model, most of the depreciation report providers will pick something right in the middle.
Something of a hybrid or adequate funding model, I'll call it, but it's something between having all special levies and having fully funded. Some kind of a shared
something in between,
middle ground.
Yeah, and the 3 models,
especially for those older strata corporations, because the fully funded model is not at a reasonable, not reasonably attainable for sure. Yeah. So they'll come up with some kind of a medium ground that might appeal.
Yeah, I call it the middle ground. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, and the thing with the financial planning models is you're not required to accept any one of them. They're just tools. Yes. They're just tools for the Strata Council to give them some idea of how much they should be putting into their reserve fund every year, but you're not required to accept any particular one of them.
Yeah, and that's a good point. As I often get clients asking me, is there enough money in the is there enough money in the CRF? And ultimately, that's a very subjective question. Yeah. So technically, as long as the Strata Corporation is putting away the minimum under the Act, which is 10% of the operating budget until you hit 25%, yes, just about every CRF out there has enough money in it from a legislative point of view.
But is it enough to fund your projects?
Yes, it's from a practical point of view, that is very rarely even scratching the surface when it comes to funding these big projects in the future. So what I always tell my clients is that's subjective, because quite honestly, they're not required to follow any of the funding models. And it really depends on that council, it depends on the owners in that building and what their goals are. Some people look at it as, if you have a fully funded model, you're subsidizing owners 20 years in the future. Are you going to be an owner in there? Are you going to benefit from that when it comes time to sell? Again, it's a very subjective question. I don't advocate one way or the other. Ultimately, it depends on the individual building and the owners therein.
Yeah, and I've heard the opposite from some strata owners is, why would I not want to fund 20 years in the future? Somebody 20 years ago funded me. I've got a roof over my head now. Yeah. So that's the way of looking at it, is it's a community. We're all in it together, and let's fund as well as we can into the future.
Yeah, one of the things that I always note when it comes to the special levies versus CRF funding debate is it is a lot easier to pass significant special levy or significant resolutions for capital cost expenditures when there's money already in the bank, versus asking people for a $10,000 or $20,000 or $30,000 special levy.
Yeah,
it's usually a lot harder sell when people actually have to pay cash out of their own pocket versus taking out the Strata Corporation savings.
Exactly. And you might be lucky enough that you can afford any special levy that gets thrown your way, but I think most of us can't. So, you know, not without going somewhere else to seek that money. I don't have it in my checking account, do you?
No. And that brings up another point, especially where the council is concerned, is what do you do in situations where there is a big special levy and owners can't pay for it. Now you're stuck in a situation where you are, as a council member, you are bound to uphold the Strata Corporation's bylaws, which include paying special levies. And sometimes you have to take actions such as liens and or foreclosure, which is not a pleasant situation for anybody to be in. So
definitely not pleasant. So better to have it in the savings account of the Strata to start with.
Is essential. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. When you're choosing your depreciation report provider, people have said, can you at Vizoa recommend anybody? Well, no, we can't recommend anybody. It's not our place to do so. But look for the length of time the company's been doing the depreciation reports. When they first came into being, they were required by 2013. So a lot of companies sprang up in late 2011, 2012. We started doing these depreciation reports. If those companies don't exist anymore, you know, then unfortunately the people who used them for the first time around got a bad deal. But look for companies who've been doing them. Lots of companies have been doing them long before they were legislatively required. Those are the kind of people you want to do yours. It could be an engineer, an appraiser. There's other companies that specialize in this type of work.
Depreciation specifically. I'd say that the two biggest ones that I've always dealt with is either engineers or appraisers. So it's something that they've done for years. Again, long-standing, and they're not somebody that just because it became a legislative requirement,
they said, "Oh, let's hang on a shingle."
Decide to start doing depreciation reports, because ultimately who can do a depreciation report is relatively it's a wide definition.
It's a very wide definition. It's really the qualifications in the regulations are really anyone who has the qualifications. Like if they say they're qualified, then they're qualified. But the interesting thing is, quite often Stratas will say, well, we've got some retired engineers that live here in the building. Can we just do our own depreciation report? And I'd really recommend against that. And if you look in the regulations, it kind of gives you a hint why. The person doing the depreciation report needs to disclose their errors and omissions insurance. Well, if you're just an owner, you probably don't have that. They also need to disclose their relationship to the strata, if any. So just the fact that those things need to be disclosed is kind of a hint that it should be someone outside the strata. So it doesn't say that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You could have somebody in the strata that's very qualified.
I would agree with you. I have seen a few depreciation reports that have been done by either the council themselves or an owner within the building, and you run into a couple issues there. A conflict of interest can be definitely an issue.
No special levies ever coming up, as I've got my place on the market to sell.
Unfortunately, I actually ran into one review that I did where the council had put their own depreciation report together. And then 2 years later, they decided to get an actual depreciation report done by an engineering firm, and the differences were massive. So the depreciation report from the engineering firm actually forecast about $30,000 on average per unit of special levies in the next 5 years, whereas the council drafted depreciation report showed no special levies.
Showed all roses and sunshine.
So huge contrast, which brings up a liability issue. As an owner, as a council member, you know what, you're probably not getting paid to do that. Don't stick your neck out there. I wouldn't take on that liability personally. I mean, myself living in strata corporations, owning in strata corporations, and doing what I do, I'm very careful to keep those two things separate.
Absolutely.
You don't want to get into that situation.
Yeah, exactly. So another thing that people may not be aware is that you need to have your depreciation report updated every 3 years. And other jurisdictions is 4 years, 5 years. I think it's 5 years in Alberta. I think it's 4 years in Ontario. And they say, well, why did the BC government make us do it every 3 years? Well, the reason for that is because our construction prices are so volatile here. And an item that you predicted a cost on is going to be completely different in 5 years from what it is today. So 3 years out, you've got a chance to have a closer prediction of the costs. That being said, stratas can postpone that renewal. It does take a 3/4 vote of the owners to postpone that renewal. They call it opting out.
Yeah.
But there's good reasons to do it sometimes. Maybe you're right in the middle of a big project and you just can't be bothered with another big project like a depreciation report. But if you're in the middle of a large project, it's going to change all the numbers on your financial projections. So that's a good reason.
That's the most common reason that I see them getting deferred, is because they'll be in the middle of getting the roof done, or the balconies remediated, or the windows or something like that. And it makes more sense to have a clean depreciation report, or have it reflect those big projects.
Have it reflect the current state.
Yeah, absolutely. And typically when there is big projects like that, like a roof or balconies or windows, there's going to be other reports involved in that from engineers,
and those all help inform
contractors.
the depreciation report.
Absolutely. Which you can get a lot of information through that stuff without having another depreciation report right in your hands. That being said, as far as the 3-year thing goes, I'm in favor of it. I know myself, when I'm doing reviews on depreciation reports that are 4 or 5 years old.
Yeah, you kind of take it with a grain of salt.
You can't rely real heavily on those numbers, especially the way that it's been, especially in the Victoria area, is our construction prices have gone up about 20% in the last 3 or 4 years. So that's a significant difference.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. I had something else on the tip of my tongue and it's gone, but that's okay. We can come back to it. So if the Strata doesn't have a depreciation report at all, the gloom and doom predictions were going to be that you wouldn't be able to sell your Strata lot if you didn't have a depreciation report. Well, I wouldn't say that is true. However, it is true that if you have a high-risk mortgage, if you're mortgaged to the penny, you've got not a lot of flexible income. Your bank might want to see the depreciation report because they need to know if they may be required to lend you some more money in the next few years. And whether you're good for it.
Service debt ratio when they're looking at the mortgage. And it is most of the lenders are wanting to see the depreciation report.
They definitely are.
It's when all this was first coming into play, there was a lot of doom and gloom predictions about not being able to get insurance and not being able to get mortgages. And I haven't seen the effects to that extent.
No.
It's definitely had an effect. I'd say that the marketability of a unit in a building that doesn't have a depreciation report is definitely lower because there's higher risk for the person coming in to buy it.
For sure.
You can do things like have a home inspector engaged to look at the unit, of course, and the Strata itself, but ultimately their scope is a lot narrower than looking at an entire Strata building.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but the banks are asking for them.
Yes.
As I say, especially for people with the high risk, the high debt mortgages. I know it was on the tip of my tongue earlier.
Coming back to you.
Well, I did come back to me. So if the Strata has a depreciation report, look in the council minutes or the AGM minutes to see have they done something with it, or is it just sitting on a shelf and they got it so they could tick the box and say they got one?
Yes.
Are they actively working it? You know, does the council meeting, council minutes say we looked at the next 5 projects predicted on our depreciation report and looked into them? Well, that shows you've got an active Strata council.
Yes. No, that's a really good point. When I'm looking at these reviews, that's a big thing that I rarely see.
Yeah.
But it is good, and it's relatively simple to do. At your AGM, you can have a report on the depreciation report. You can list the items that were forecast to come up that year, and just give a few words of a summary of what's going on, whether or not it's being pursued, whether or not you're getting quotes, whether or not it doesn't need to be done right now.
Exactly.
Just some kind of an update so the owners and potential owners have some idea what's going on. Because ultimately, I'd say probably 95% of the Strata corporations that I'm looking at don't have any reference to what's going on.
And they should. It's so important.
And most Stratas are not following any of the funding models specifically. And if they are, they rarely comment on that. That's up to you to determine through the financials, through the contributions, through the current CRF level, all that sort of stuff. So it's a little bit of an investigation to actually find out what's going on in the Strata Corporation, because they rarely say in a resolution that we're following
model 3.
Yeah, exactly. So little tip for council members, anybody watching this, is include that information. A paragraph would go a long ways to inform people what's going on.
Inform the current owners as well as potential purchasers.
Yeah,
for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the things that I would like to bring up for potential buyers, and this is something that is somewhat disconcerting to me and I see on a fairly regular basis, is situations where things have been purposely omitted from the depreciation report.
Purposely?
Purposely. So what happens is, and depending on the person providing the report, some of them will do it, some of them will not, where the council has requested that components be omitted.
Oh my God.
So the providers that are actually making those omissions will usually put in something fairly bolded and underlined saying the Strata Corporation directed us to leave out the windows or leave out the roof.
Wow.
And it's happening more often than
No,
it
I've
should.
not seen that.
Oh,
so,
really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's
Wow.
learning something new every day.
We definitely do. In
Yeah,
Strata
no,
land.
it is something that's somewhat disconcerting. So when I'm talking to service providers, that's always one of the questions I ask them is, what would you do in a situation where a council directed you to leave something off of the report? And if they say, well, no, we won't do that, great. That's a service provider you want, because ultimately, as soon as components start being omitted, that report is no longer valid under the regulations.
Of course not. Yeah. Now, I have heard some horror stories about depreciation reports that accidentally omitted something important. I heard one that it just forgot completely that the Strata is responsible for the windows. The windows weren't in the depreciation report anywhere. That would not be a good thing.
We just had a couple comments from Jean Medland, realtor in Victoria here. And she says, buyers are very used to getting a chance to review depreciation reports, so it gets awkward when there is not one. Absolutely, it leaves a whole lot of questions unanswered. I completely agree, Jean. And can you talk about how the Stratas are handling updates to reports now that they have been in place for a number of years? You know, a few building technologists offer updates at an affordable rate. So typically the updates, if you stay with the same company,
provider,
they are significantly cheaper than the original one because they've got the template there, and all they have to do is really plug in new numbers.
And they can rely on the guy who did it the first time because it's them. If you're getting a new provider for your update, they won't rely on the first depreciation report. They'll start everything fresh again. So it's going to cost almost as much to get your update from a different company.
And as far as funding that goes, a couple options. Some depreciation reports will actually include the cost of the depreciation report within the depreciation report. So there should be a budget in there from the CRF, so you can approve that through a majority vote. If it's in the depreciation report, you can approve that by a majority vote from the CRF. Or a lot of Strata corporations are incorporating it into their budget.
Right, into the cost of the budget.
Yes, which originally was a little bit of a contentious item. Some
wasn't really understood if we could do that.
You could fund it through the budget, and some said you couldn't. And ultimately, I think the common practice now is that it's accepted that you can fund that.
They've amended the legislation to specifically say that you can fund it through the everyday budget. There you go.
So so funding it either through the CRF. I mean, theoretically, you could do a special levy, but I don't really see that very often.
No.
Or through the budget itself.
Yeah.
And I'd say, based on my experience, a lot of Strata corporations are deferring it maybe to 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
But for the most part, the Strata corporations are getting their updates done.
Yeah, for sure.
I very rarely run into, I've done probably over 200 reviews now, and I very rarely run into buildings that don't have depreciation reports.
Yeah, there's not many out there. We've got the word out.
Yes, the biggest ones that I see is Fairland Stratas, which a lot of people don't realize you are still required to have a depreciation report.
Yeah, and you have more things, more components than you think you do, whether it's your underground services, your lighting, your roadways.
And those they're all very expensive.
Yeah, they may not need replacing for a good long time, but they're incredibly expensive when they do need replacing.
Absolutely.
So what's wrong with putting a little bit aside every month from every owner, saving up the pile, and working it out there. Now, one thing we forgot to mention, when your depreciation report provider is going through all of your common property, they don't do invasive testing. It's a visual test, a visual inspection only. So they're not going to drill a hole in the wall to see if there's wet rot inside. It's just on visual inspection. So it's not a guarantee. That's why it's not a guarantee of costs. It's an estimate based on the visual inspection. As you approach the date when something is projected to be needed to be replaced, that's when you start doing some proper invasive testing and see what the condition is. Yeah,
and that's quite common for the reports to pick out little things and say, hey, you might want to investigate this a little bit more. So it's quite often you will see depreciation reports that recommend getting a BECA done, a building envelope condition assessment,
and build that into your
testing for your electrical, and they'll actually include that in the depreciation report projections as well. So that's part of your funding model.
Yeah, exactly, because it costs money to have some of these reports done, and you need to plan ahead for that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's important to remember that the depreciation report is a really high level view. It doesn't get into the weeds. It doesn't get into the details.
No.
It's meant as a general overview. But again, depending on the service providers, really adept service providers will point out signs of potential issues that you may want to investigate further.
Yeah, for sure. And suggestions on how to mitigate your damages going forward even.
Absolutely.
Your roof, I always use the roof as the example. Your roof is due for replacement in 5 years, but if you do this much preventative maintenance or do this one section, you could probably get 7 or 8 years out of it, as an example.
Yeah. One of the other things that I'll mention too, just as far as that goes, is depending on the service provider again, and depending on the council too, because the council does have a fairly large degree of input into how the report is formatted, what the funding scenarios are, that sort of thing. And one of the things that I see fairly often is where they'll spread out, say, window replacements over 5 years or 10 years. So we'll do 10% of the windows this year and 10% of the windows next year.
I don't like that idea.
As a practice, I don't particularly like that. I know if I was in a building and all my neighbors were getting their windows replaced and I had to wait 8 years to get new windows,
yeah, exactly.
I wouldn't be super keen on that.
Well, what about eight years from now? Everybody else has got theirs done. They vote no to mine getting done.
Yes.
We've seen that happen. There's been some really bad Supreme Court cases about that very situation, actually.
And not only that, is there's no guarantee that the windows that you're going to get this year are going to be the same as the windows you get next year. Quality can change.
Too much can go wrong.
And there's typically a lot of cost savings from doing the entire building at one time. It's kind of a financing thing where, you're hit with a larger cost up front.
But you save it in the long run. And that even goes into tying different projects together. If you're doing, say, the windows and the balconies, it would be horrendously expensive to do them in the same year, but you will get some savings by only having to put up the scaffolding once, having the same contractors on site only once. So, maybe you want to postpone one project for a couple of years and bring one forward a couple of years, do them at the same time to see if you can save some money that way. So we're getting way deeper into this than we intended to, but that's okay because we're almost out of time.
We're almost out of time. Yeah, so on that point, again, there's a ton of information about depreciation reports, and it's been written about ad nauseum. Of course, if you have any other questions, you're more than welcome to leave a comment here. But there is a ton of information. They're good to get some level of understanding on it. One of the things that I've been advocating with, because I do talk to a lot of the service providers and engineers and appraisers that are doing these reports, and one of the things that I've mentioned to quite a few of them is have the depreciation report. And as Sandy said, quite often they're 150, 200 pages, but also just have a summary. You can have a 10, 12 page summary that really covers off probably 90% of the information that you need. So separate that out. And a lot of the service providers are doing that. I'd say the higher end ones are the little bit better.
The executive
ones.
Summary.
Yes, they're putting together a bit more of an executive summary. That's so you don't really need to read through 150 pages to get.
You read the summary and read the bottom line on the last page.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly.
That's really what you need. I didn't understand that last question.
Any comments on whether self-managed stratas actually save the process gotten too complex once a building surpasses a certain number of strata lots? Well, ultimately, it depends on the self-managed strata, and we're kind of getting into a separate topic here, but self-managed stratas, generally speaking, are not in as good of a position as managed stratas from many different viewpoints. It could be the depreciation reports, it could be their minutes, it could be the lack of meetings in general. I mean, I've done reviews on self-managed strata corporations that only had one meeting a year, and even at that, their minutes are very bare bones. So typically, and again, this is just very generally speaking, there are good self-managed strata corporations out there, but most of the time, you don't see the level of thought and planning going into a self-managed strata that you do with a strata
because you don't have the expertise.
They don't have the expertise. It is strata corporations are getting increasingly complex. I mean, that's why I've started consulting for smaller self-managed strata corporations.
And that's why I was always still around after all these years.
Here. And that's something that we're going to be doing a panel at the end of May.
End of May, yeah.
End of May. So that's going to be one of the big topics is how the strata management industry and stratas in general are
how
going
the
to
whole
function
strata
going
world
forward,
is changing.
because there is a lot of big changes coming down the pipeline.
Yeah, that'll be a good talk, actually.
Yeah.
So speaking of, we'll talk about some upcoming events.
Yes.
So April 27th, Ryan and I are doing a workshop together called Before You Buy a Condo. So if you have friends, relatives who are thinking of buying their very first strata unit, they might want to find out all the things that they need to know, because don't we all wish we had a little more information before we went in?
Yeah.
So not great detail, high level information about the basics that anybody needs to know before they go into a strata.
Yeah, and it's amazing the number of my clients that I deal with that come to me not necessarily because there's specific issues with the building, but just because they don't have a good understanding of stratas in general.
Yeah.
So this is a great resource. Any realtors out there, it'd be good for you guys to brush up on this. But it's also something you can refer your clients to.
Yeah, for sure.
If you have clients that are getting into a strata corporation for the first time, this is a great opportunity for them to learn about strata corporation, so they know what they're getting
and how
into.
it's different from your single family home.
Yep.
Yeah, and then a month later, Ryan, as he mentioned, he's on a panel with 7 or 8 other guest speakers talking about the future of stratas. And that's I want to say the 26th of May, 26th or 27th of May. And that'll be at the Comfort Inn here in Victoria. It's a Sunday afternoon. It should be a real
all the
good
details
afternoon.
aren't quite out yet. I think they're going out later this week.
Details will be out later this week.
Yeah.
So watch on the Visoa website for that. For sure. So when's our next Condo Q session?
May 14th.
May 14th.
So unfortunately, this is my fault. April 23rd is the Tuesday after Easter long weekend, so I will be visiting family. So unfortunately, I won't make it back.
I'm not techie enough to do this alone.
We'll get there.
We'll get there. So we're skipping the second one in April, but May 14th, we'll be right back here. Right back here.
We're talking about repairs and maintenance.
Repairs and maintenance.
Whose responsibility they are.
Yes, an always tricky topic. It really is. That's the most common question we get at Visoa Helpline is who's responsible for it? Who pays? So there you go.
Yes, great. Well, thank you all for tuning in. Again, if you're watching this after the fact and you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. The event is monitored both by the Visoa staff and myself with Condo Clear, so we'll be happy to point you in the right direction or give you some information. And until next time, nice to see you again.
Thanks for watching.